It was one of those nights where everything seemed to go wrong. You know the type: long day at work, stuck in traffic, and by the time I was finally heading home, all I wanted was something quick to eat so I could just crash. It was probably around 10 p.m., and I figured I'd hit the McDonald's near my place. I wasn't in the mood to cook, and I knew I could get something fast and easy there. When I pulled into the parking lot, it was nearly empty, which wasn't surprising given the time. The lights inside were still bright, but the place had that quiet, almost eerie feel that late-night fast food joints get when there aren't many people around. There were only a couple of cars parked outside, and I remember thinking how dead it was for a weeknight. I walked in, and the first thing I noticed was how cold it was inside. Not just the regular air conditioning cold, but that kind of chill that makes you wish you'd brought a jacket. The counter was empty except for the guy working behind it, who barely looked up when I walked in. He had that tired, indifferent expression that said he'd rather be anywhere else. I ordered my usual Big Mac, fries, and a Coke, and while I was waiting, I scanned the place. There was a couple sitting in a booth near the back, sharing a quiet conversation, and a guy sitting alone a few tables away from them. He caught my eye because he wasn't eating, just sitting there with a coffee, staring out the window like he was lost in thought. Something about him seemed off, but I didn't think much of it at the time. Maybe he was just having a rough night like I was. My order came up, and I grabbed my tray, looking for a spot to sit. I chose a booth near the window, not too far from the entrance. I like to watch the street when I eat. People coming and going, cars passing by. It's a small distraction, something to focus on while you're killing time. I started eating, scrolling through my phone, trying to unwind from the day. I was about halfway through my burger when I noticed the guy with the coffee was still just sitting there, staring out the window. I figured maybe he was waiting for someone, but there was something about the way he was sitting, so still, so focused, that made me uneasy. It was like he was watching something outside, but when I glanced out the window, there was nothing there. Just the empty parking lot and the occasional car passing by. Trying to shake off the weird feeling, I went back to my food. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw him move. Not in a normal way, though. He didn't turn his head or shift in his seat. It was more like he just slid his gaze over to me, like he knew I was watching him and wanted me to know it. I tried to ignore it, but the more I tried, the more I could feel his eyes on me, like this heavy, uncomfortable pressure. I kept telling myself it was nothing, that I was just tired and reading too much into it, but it wasn't long before I couldn't take it anymore. I glanced up, trying to catch his eye, maybe give him a nod or something to break the tension, but when I looked over, he wasn't staring at me anymore. He was staring at the entrance, and his expression had changed. He looked terrified. I turned to see what he was looking at, but the entrance was empty, just the doors slowly closing behind someone who had just left. I couldn't see anyone outside, just the darkened parking lot and the street beyond. But the way he was looking, it was like he'd seen something, or someone, that really freaked him out. At that point, I started to get this uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. The kind of feeling you get when you know something's wrong, but you can't put your finger on what it is. I tried to go back to my meal, but the atmosphere had changed. The whole place felt colder, quieter, like the air had gotten thicker, and it was harder to breathe. I decided it was time to go. I wasn't even hungry anymore. I just wanted to get out of there. I packed up the rest of my food, took a last sip of my Coke, and stood up to leave. As I walked past the guy with the coffee, I couldn't help but glance at him again. He was still staring at the door, his hands gripping the table so hard his knuckles were white. I walked outside, and the cold air hit me like a slap in the face. It was colder than it should have been for that time of year, and it only added to the unease that was building inside me. I walked quickly to my car, trying to shake the feeling that I was being watched. But when I got to my car and fumbled with the keys, I looked back at the restaurant and saw him, still sitting there, still staring out the window. But now his eyes were locked on me. I don't know what it was about that look, but it made my skin crawl. It wasn't just that he was watching me, it was the intensity of it, like he was trying to tell me something, warn me about something, but I couldn't figure out what. I got in my car, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I couldn't help but glance back at the McDonald's. The guy was still there, still watching, and as I drove away, I saw him stand up, like he was about to follow me. That's when I floored it. I drove home, trying to put the whole thing out of my mind, but it stuck with me. The way he looked at me, the fear in his eyes, something about it just didn't sit right. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see his car following me, but there was nothing, just the empty streets and the glow of streetlights passing by. When I finally got home, I parked in the driveway and sat there for a minute, trying to calm down. I kept telling myself it was just a weird guy having a bad night, that I was overreacting, but the feeling of unease wouldn't go away. I checked the locks on my doors and windows twice that night before going to bed, and even then, I had trouble falling asleep. The next morning, I woke up to a normal day. The sun was shining, birds were chirping, and it was like nothing had happened. But when I went out to my car to head to work, I found something that made my blood run cold. There was a piece of paper tucked under the windshield wiper. At first, I thought it was just a flyer or something, but when I picked it up, I saw it wasn't. It was a note, handwritten in messy, almost frantic script. It said, "You were right to leave. Don't go back." I stood there, staring at the note, my mind racing. I hadn't told anyone about what happened the night before, so who could have left this? The handwriting didn't match anyone I knew, and the more I looked at it, the more unsettled I felt. I didn't go back to that McDonald's. In fact, I went out of my way to avoid it after that. I'd drive an extra 10 minutes to another fast food place just so I wouldn't have to pass by. But the thing that still bothers me, even now, is the thought that maybe I wasn't the one the note was meant for. Maybe it was him, the guy with the coffee. Maybe he knew something I didn't, and maybe that night I got away from something a lot worse than just a strange encounter. It's been a few years now, but I still think about that night whenever I pass a McDonald's late at night. I wonder if that guy is still out there, sitting in some other McDonald's, staring out the window, waiting for something or someone to walk in. And I wonder if whoever or whatever he was afraid of finally found him. There was this one night a few years back that still gives me the creeps whenever I think about it. It's not like it was some big dramatic event, nothing that would make the news or anything like that, but it was one of those moments where everything feels off, and you can't quite shake the feeling that something's really wrong. It was a Friday, and I'd just gotten off work later than usual. You know how it is, end of the week, everyone's dragging, and I was just exhausted. I didn't feel like cooking, and I didn't want to wait for a delivery, so I decided to swing by a fast food place on my way home. There was a Burger King not too far from my apartment, so I figured I'd grab a quick bite there. I'm not even a huge fan of fast food, but it was convenient, and I was too tired to care about anything else. By the time I got there, it was close to 10:30 p.m. The place was almost empty, which was normal for that time of night. Just a couple of cars in the drive-thru and a few people inside. I parked my car and walked in, already looking forward to getting my food and heading home. The first thing that hit me when I walked in was how quiet it was. Not in a peaceful way though, more like an uncomfortable silence. Like everyone was waiting for something to happen. There were two guys behind the counter, and they both looked up when I came in, but neither of them said anything. Just kind of stared at me for a second before one of them finally asked for my order. I asked for a Whopper, fries, and a drink, trying to ignore the weird vibe in the place. While I waited for my food, I glanced around. There were only two other customers sitting in the dining area. An older man sitting alone in a corner booth, and a woman with a little girl a few tables away. The woman was on her phone, barely paying attention to the kid, who was quietly playing with a toy. The guy behind the counter handed me my drink, and I went to fill it up at the soda fountain. That's when I noticed something strange. The older man in the corner booth was staring at the woman and her kid. Not just looking, but really staring, like he was focused on them in a way that felt off. He wasn't eating or drinking anything, just sitting there with this intense look on his face. It made me uncomfortable, but I figured maybe he was just an odd guy or something. I mean, it's not like you don't see weird people in fast food places sometimes. I got my food and sat down at a table near the window, a few seats away from the woman and her kid. I pulled out my phone, planning to scroll through some stuff while I ate, but I couldn't shake that weird feeling I'd had since walking in. Every now and then, I'd glance up at the older man, and he was always still staring at the woman and her kid. It was starting to freak me out, but I didn't know what to do. It wasn't like he was doing anything, just sitting there, but something about it felt wrong. After a few minutes, the woman must have noticed it too, because she looked up from her phone and saw him watching them. She looked uncomfortable, but she didn't say anything. Instead, she grabbed her daughter's hand and started packing up their things, like she was in a hurry to leave. The kids started whining, not wanting to go, but the woman seemed pretty determined to get out of there. As they were leaving, the older man suddenly stood up and started walking toward them. He wasn't moving fast, just casually, but there was something about the way he moved that set off alarm bells in my head. It was like he'd been waiting for this moment, like he was just biding his time until they decided to leave. The woman noticed him coming and practically dragged her kid toward the door. She looked scared now, like she didn't want to make a scene but was definitely freaked out. The guy kept following them, still with that same slow, deliberate pace. I don't know what came over me, but I stood up and walked over to the woman. I didn't really have a plan. I just knew I didn't want her to be alone with this guy following her. I asked if she needed any help, trying to keep my voice calm, and she looked at me with this relieved expression, like she was grateful someone had noticed. The older man stopped when he saw me talking to her, and for a moment, we just stood there in this weird standoff. He didn't say anything, just stared at me, and I could feel the tension in the air. I didn't know what he was planning to do, but I wasn't about to find out. I suggested to the woman that she and her daughter should leave through the side door where I had parked, and I offered to walk them to their car. She agreed, and we started heading toward the door, the little girl clutching her mother's hand tightly. The older man didn't follow us this time, just stood there watching, but I could feel his eyes on us the whole way. When we got outside, I walked them to their car and waited until they were safely inside. The woman thanked me, her voice shaky, and I just told her to be careful. She drove off, and I stood there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. When I finally turned to go back inside, I noticed the older man standing at the entrance, watching me through the glass doors. He wasn't smiling, wasn't showing any emotion at all, just standing there with that same intense stare. It was unnerving, and I decided I didn't need to finish my meal after all. I got in my car and left, glancing back as I pulled out of the parking lot. He was still standing there, watching me drive away. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the whole thing. What was that guy's deal? What would have happened if I hadn't stepped in? It's not like I did anything heroic. I just stood there, but something about it felt like it made a difference. But what really bothered me was the thought that maybe this wasn't the first time he'd done something like that. Maybe he hangs out at places like that Burger King, just waiting for someone vulnerable to come along. For weeks after, I avoided that Burger King. I didn't want to risk running into that guy again, but eventually, curiosity got the better of me, and I drove by one night just to see if he was there. The place looked normal, just a few cars in the lot, but I didn't stop. I kept driving, trying to put it out of my mind, but every now and then, I still think about that night. I wonder if he ever went back, if he found someone else to follow. It's one of those things that sticks with you. A reminder that sometimes the scariest situations aren't the ones with obvious danger. They're the ones that seem normal, right up until the moment they're not. And I guess that's the part that really gets to me, because you never know when you might walk into a place like that, thinking it's just another ordinary night, and end up in a situation you can't quite explain, but one that leaves you looking over your shoulder long after it's over. I've got one for you. It happened a couple of years ago, and even though nothing *crazy* happened, it still gives me the chills whenever I think about it. It was just one of those nights where everything felt off, you know? Like something was in the air and you could just sense it. So it was a Thursday night and I was starving. I'd had one of those days at work that just wouldn't end, and by the time I was done, I didn't have the energy to cook or even wait for delivery. There's a Subway not too far from my place, and since it's open late, I figured I'd just grab a sandwich and call it a night. When I got there, it was pretty dead, which wasn't too surprising given the time. It was around 10:30 p.m., and the place had that empty, almost too clean vibe that fast food joints get when there aren't many people around. There were a couple of cars in the parking lot, but not much else going on. The lights inside were bright, almost too bright, and I remember thinking how quiet it was. Like the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're the only person left in the world. I walked in, and the first thing that hit me was how cold it was inside. Not just cool like you'd expect from AC, but freezing. The guy behind the counter looked up at me as I walked in, and I noticed he was shivering a bit too. He gave me a half-hearted welcome to Subway and asked what I wanted. I could tell he was just as tired as I was, probably counting down the minutes until he could close up and go home. I ordered my usual, a foot-long turkey with all the veggies, and as I stood there watching him make it, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. There was a guy sitting at one of the tables in the corner, alone, with his head down. He had a hoodie on, the kind that hides most of your face, and he was hunched over like he was trying to stay unnoticed. I didn't think much of it at first, probably just some guy grabbing a late-night bite like me, but as I waited, I couldn't help but feel like something was off. The guy didn't move, didn't eat, didn't even look up. He was just sitting there, completely still, almost like he was frozen in place. The longer I stood there, the more uncomfortable I got. It wasn't anything obvious, but there was just this weird vibe in the air. Like something was wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on it. The guy behind the counter finished making my sandwich, wrapped it up, and handed it over with a tired smile. I paid, grabbed my food, and turned to leave, but I felt this strange urge to look back at the guy in the corner. When I did, I realized he was staring at me. Not just looking, but staring. Like his eyes were locked onto me and wouldn't let go. I froze for a second, my heart skipping a beat, because there was something really unsettling about his gaze. It wasn't angry or threatening, just hollow, like he was looking through me, not at me. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. It had been a long day, and I was tired. I headed toward the door, but before I could reach it, I noticed the guy had stood up. He didn't make a sound, didn't say anything, just stood up, still staring at me. At that moment, I felt this wave of fear wash over me. I can't explain it, but it was like my instincts were screaming at me to get out of there. Fast. I hurried out the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I could feel the guy's eyes on me the whole way to my car. I fumbled with my keys, trying to unlock the door as quickly as possible. And when I finally got inside, I locked the doors and started the engine. I looked back toward the subway, and the guy was standing in the doorway, just watching me. He didn't move, didn't come after me, just stood there, like he was waiting for something. I pulled out of the parking lot and drove home as fast as I could. The whole time I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see him following me, but there was nothing. Just the dark, empty streets and the glow of the streetlights. But that feeling of unease didn't go away, even after I got home and locked all my doors. I tried to eat my sandwich, but I couldn't. My appetite was gone, replaced by this gnawing anxiety that I couldn't shake. I kept thinking about that guy. Why was he there? What was his deal? Why did he make me feel so uneasy? The questions kept spinning around in my head, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't come up with any answers that made sense. I went to bed that night, but sleep didn't come easy. I kept hearing noises, little creaks and groans from the apartment, the wind outside. But every time I got up to check, there was nothing there. Just my imagination, I kept telling myself, but that didn't make me feel any better. The next day, I tried to put it out of my mind. I went to work, tried to focus on my tasks, but that weird feeling from the night before just wouldn't go away. It was like a shadow hanging over me, reminding me that something wasn't right. I even thought about going back to that subway, just to see if the guy was there again, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. The thought of running into him again was too much. A few days later, I was driving home from work, and I passed by that subway. It looked normal, just like it always did, but something made me slow down. I don't know why, but I felt this strange urge to stop, to go inside and see if that guy was there. But then I thought about how I'd felt that night, how scared I'd been, and I kept driving. I didn't want to take the chance of running into him again. That night, I had trouble sleeping again. I kept thinking about the guy in the hoodie, about how he'd stared at me with those empty eyes. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that what scared me the most wasn't just him, it was the fact that I couldn't figure out why he'd scared me so much. I'd been in plenty of weird situations before, but this was different. It was like my body knew something my mind didn't, like it was trying to warn me about something I couldn't see. After that, I started avoiding that subway altogether. It wasn't like I thought I'd run into the guy again. I mean, what were the chances, right? But I just couldn't bring myself to go back there. Every time I thought about it, that feeling of dread would creep back in, and I'd find an excuse to go somewhere else. A couple of weeks went by, and things started to go back to normal. I stopped thinking about that night so much, started sleeping better, and eventually, I convinced myself that it had just been a fluke. A bad night where I let my imagination get the best of me. But then something happened that brought it all back. I was at work, going through my usual routine, when I overheard a couple of my coworkers talking about something that had happened at a Subway not too far from our office. I wasn't really paying attention at first, but then I heard them mention a guy in a hoodie, and my heart skipped a beat. I asked them what they were talking about, and they told me that a couple of nights ago, there had been some kind of incident at the Subway near our office. Apparently, a customer had freaked out and started causing a scene, and when the employees tried to calm him down, he pulled out a knife. They said he wasn't after money or anything. He was just acting crazy, like he was on something, or maybe just completely out of his mind. My blood ran cold when they mentioned that he was wearing a hoodie, and the description they gave sounded eerily similar to the guy I'd seen that night. They said the police had been called, and they eventually managed to subdue him without anyone getting hurt. But the whole thing had left everyone shaken. I couldn't help but wonder if it was the same guy. Maybe it wasn't, but the timing and the description were too close for comfort. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized how lucky I'd been to get out of that Subway without anything happening. If it was the same guy, who knows what he might have done if I'd stayed there any longer. After that, I couldn't stop thinking about how close I might have come to being in real danger that night. It's not like I did anything special. I just followed my gut and got out of there. But it made me realize how important it is to trust your instincts, even when you can't explain why something feels off. I never went back to that Subway, and I started being a lot more careful about where I go late at night. Maybe it was just a coincidence, or maybe I narrowly avoided something really bad. Either way, it's a night I won't forget anytime soon. And even now, whenever I see someone in a hoodie sitting alone in a fast food place, I can't help but feel that same sense of unease, that same instinct telling me to keep my distance. Because sometimes, the scariest things aren't what you can see. They're the things you can only sense, the things your body knows before your mind can catch up. And that's a feeling that's hard to shake, no matter how much time goes by.